If I can have someone take the roll call. I said we are about to begin the Budget Review Commission meeting of March 27, 2025, and I need someone to do the roll call.
Chair Smith.
Present.
Vice Chair Schweiker.
Present.
Commissioner Carla.
Here.
Commissioner Newman.
Here.
Commissioner Ransko.
Present.
Commissioner Seitz.
Here.
Commissioner Stevens.
Present.
Everyone being present, will remind everyone that the beginning of our meeting is a time for public comment. If anyone has public comments, they can pick up one of the blue cards over here at the administrative desk, fill it out, and make a comment. I have no speakers requesting time at this moment. So I am going to ask the city treasurer to, well, I guess it's time for the chair's report. Is that right? So being the chair, I guess I'll report. We are going to cover a little bit later the procedure for each of the commissioners up here to submit comments that might be incorporated into our required meeting with the city council. I won't spend any time on that. I'll let them talk about the procedure, but I do want to reiterate the importance to all my fellow commissioners of gleaning through your prior notes and minutes of prior meetings and trying to figure out what do you think on there would be a good piece of advice to give to the city council. And then those are all going to be amalgamated into a report that we will hopefully have prepared for them at our joint session on April 22. The other thing that comes under this general heading of the chair's report are some of the questions that have been asked in previous meetings and now answered by staff. And I'm not sure, Sonia, are you leading us through this, discussion of these questions?
Mr. Chairman, no, these are just provided for information. There's no presentation or discussion.
So I don't think then that the public has access to these, or are they part of the agenda? I'm getting an affirmative nod. They are part of the agenda.
They are part of the agenda and posted on the web.
Then I would ask each of the members up here to let me know if you have any questions. You presumably have read through these responses to the questions, and do you have further questions, having now seen the responses? For some reason, I don't have a screen working here. Is that right? I mean, I don't know who might want to talk. Normally, it shows on a screen in front of me. Trust me, it's blank. While we're waiting, if anybody up here has a particular item that they would like to comment on, make sure they understand or ask for further information, then raise your hand. Everyone except you, Commissioner Stevens. Commissioner Stevens.
I just had two quick things. One, I don't know who asked on item 4, I'm not sure who asked the question, but you asked if developers paid 100% of infrastructure, and the response says the overall community goal is to have new development paid by them. And so my observation to that is that kind of infers there are situations where the city does contribute to some of it. And my understanding is it's a more complex matrix that we can, I think, take on this year. But for whoever asked that question, we ought to think about, is that something that we want to look at next year as part of our work to see if that's something that we need to dig into. And so that was one. And then the only other question I had was on the 228 meeting, item 6. It talked about if we hire a person from another city and they've got years of service that are already part of the same pension plan, that we inherit their years of service. And it was unclear to me about whether or not we then, that ends up becoming our obligation, or whether we get any of the dollars that were funded towards that person. So that might not be something we can answer or address now, but if all of a sudden the city of Scottsdale starts getting experienced people from elsewhere, we inherit their projected benefit obligation without getting any of the access to the allocated dollars that have been funded towards it. It just seems like that would be unfair. But it's, so I guess that's just an observation we can maybe talk about some other time. That's all I had.
Thank you, Commissioner Stevens. The staff wishes to answer a question here.
Mr. Chairman, speaking to whether your screen, we don't have budget staff today running the voting machine. I guess they're working on putting the budget together, so I think that's probably a byproduct of that.
So will it ever fix itself or no? The question was, will it ever fix itself?
Possibly not at this meeting, Mr. Chair, but in future meetings, we will have staff here to be able to run it. I think the intent, Mr. Chair, today is to do roll call votes as we go, and then just for you to call on people as they raise their hands.
That's what it's going to have to be. It may be a little awkward. Anyone else have their hand up? Otherwise, I have a question I'll proceed with on the items here. Let me just proceed. One of the items that we had requested, and it was from the February 28th meeting, and the question was from me, did we have a list of employees that are in the ASRS plan? Not a list of employees, but could you tell me the employees that are in the ASRS plan? The first answer provided was that 1,756 employees are enrolled in ASRS. That's no doubt true, but the question was a little bit more complex than that. If you turn to the last page of this Q&A that's attached, and it is in response to, I guess, item 5, you have a table in there that shows the Scottsdale Fire Department and the Scottsdale Police Department, and it has active members, but it also has retirees, drop retirees, beneficiaries, and so on and so forth. My interest was in having the same kind of data for the PSPRS, or the ASRS plan. I think you have given me 1,756 as being the active members. That's line 1 off this table. I'm interested to know how many people do we have that are Scottsdale retirees, or do they lose their Scottsdale identity once they retire? And there's no way to know. But if you can complete that schedule for the ASRS plan with the same level of detail, that's really what I was looking for when I first asked the question. A second observation, and it's more an observation than it is a question, but it is an answer to number 3 on that same packet from the February 28 Budget Review Commission meeting. The question must have been, what has Scottsdale's payroll growth been over the past few years? And you have provided a 10-year display of the growth in payroll. And I couldn't help but notice that while you say on the blue line that is displayed on this graph for the ASRS employees, the payroll growth over the whole period of 10 years has been 3.5% on average. But for some reason in 2022 through 2024, the number seems to have moved from 110 on the dollars and thousands, I guess, or millions, I don't know what it is. But it's gone up more dramatically in the last 3 years. And maybe as a follow-up question, I know that's COVID related, but even going back to an earlier period, it appears to be larger than 3.5% growth in the overall payroll for the past, I'll say 3 years, past 5 years, almost any period other than the past 10. While I'm jabbering up here, has anyone else a question that they'd like to ask on these Q&A slides? Commissioner Carla.
Quick question about your previous question about how many of these retirees, et cetera, are still living in Scottsdale? Is that what you're asking? How many are still Scottsdale resident?
I was not asking if they're living in Scottsdale, it's just if they are, how many retirees that were Scottsdale employees and then retired, how many of them are associated with the ASRS program still as a retiree?
Okay, that helps me. Thank you.
I do have on the February 27 Q&A responses, I have a follow-up question or a clarification. On item 3, the question was posed, what has the city's primary and secondary property taxes been over time? And the table that was provided shows what the tax rate has been over time. My question was more to the dollar amount, knowing that two things happen that improve the collections on property taxes. Actually, three things, I guess, but the new construction coming on. I mean, the rate is one of them, but it's only one of the factors that plays into the thing. The other factor, of course, is the dollar amount of taxable property in the city. And so my question was not as to the rate, but as to the dollar amount, both primary and secondary tax collections. And then finally, I would make an observation, perhaps for the public at large. The question was raised, do other municipalities, and I'm still on the February 27 Q&A, do other municipalities have sales taxes that sunset, in other words, temporary taxes? And the answer was only Phoenix on the schedule has a sales tax that will sunset, and then you describe the ones. You provide then a comparison of local sales tax rates as a graph accompanying that answer. And it was really to that graph that my point was raised. Scottsdale appears on that graph as having a rate of 1.7% compared to many of the other cities ranging from 1.5 to 3.0. I was trying to illustrate both graphically and narratively that Scottsdale's comparative rate, meaning Scottsdale's permanent tax rate, is not 1.7, it's only 1.3. And we would move from the second lowest to the absolute dead lowest of any city on this graph, because all the other components of our 1.7 tax are temporary in nature, some expiring 3 years from now, some 8 or 9 years from now, and of course the most recent one passed last November would expire 30 years from now. So again, the illustration I was trying to make was our comparative tax, meaning our permanent tax compared to other cities. Any other questions from anybody? Commissioner Carla.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, you know, I appreciate staff giving all these answers and all of this information. I would ask the commissioners, because, for example, today we don't have staff to help with the presentations because they're busy elsewhere. I guess I would ask us, and we all have our own interests, that if we feel a question is important to ask staff for the things we're working on now, that, you know, that's very understandable, but I would ask us each to consider if we're adding more and more time on for staff, that maybe we consider if it's an item we won't be discussing until next budget over the summer, that maybe we hold that and just make a note to ourselves that in order to discuss this parking lot item, you know, we'll ask it over the summer and get that information then. Because I just worry that we are loading so much on to staff that they're not having time to do the work they need to do for us to actually have input on the things we can affect this upcoming budget. So I would just ask everybody to please consider that. Thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, I would echo agreement with what Carla's saying on that. You know, if there are things that for the future years that we just, you know, or if we do tell staff, we tell them we don't need it now, we need it in the fall.
Are there any other comments from commissioners on the Q&As provided? Seeing none, let's move on to item one, official item one on the agenda, which is the approval of minutes of March 19, 2025. Does anyone have any corrections to make to the minutes? Commissioner Carla.
Yes, on page 5, third paragraph, third line, it starts with "she explained." That should be Miss Andrews explained, because it's not clear whether you're calling Commissioner Newman a she or if it is Miss Andrews. So if we could get that clarification, it would be great. Thank you.
And for the record, my pronouns are he, him.
I have one comment that is probably trivial, but it may confuse somebody. On page 6, the third paragraph begins regarding the pavement overlay program. I think it means to say overlay program. People won't perhaps know what an overlay program is. Any other questions or comments on the minutes? If not, I would entertain a motion to adopt the minutes.
I make a motion to adopt the minutes.
Do I have a second? I have a second from Mr. Newman. I'm sorry. He withdraws his second, and he has a question.
On the third page, third paragraph, it says 15% preserve protection, that be 0.15%? Or did somebody mention that? Third page, third paragraph.
It should be the 0.15%.
Yeah. So, I would,
Yes.
now I'll second that. So,
And now he
Approving the
offers his second to the motion. Commissioner Ransko was the member who offered the motion, if you need that for the records. I have a motion and second. All in favor, raise your right or left hand. All in favor unanimously. The second item on our agenda is capital projects with an increase exceeding $1 million and 10% from last year to this year. And to explain to the audience, a couple of our members, Commissioner Mark Stevens and Vice Chair Dan Schweikert, stepped aside and meetings with staff investigated this at some length rather than having the whole commission encumbered with looking at all these capital projects. So they're going to have input on this, maybe be taking the lead. So who starts on this? Commissioner Stevens, do you?
Actually, there was, our city manager was going to start with a few slides that he had put together at a prior meeting that tie into this. I think he was going to go first.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Chair. So if we could have next slide. As referenced, we thought it would be a nice introduction to kind of recap how a capital project comes to fruition or comes to the forefront. Next slide, please. It kind of reminds me of government days back when you're a little kid. How does a bill become a law? And so this is how does an idea become a capital project? We'll start off with some technical components I would refer to, which are pretty standard. And so it's a certain dollar amount, 50,000 is the threshold. It's got life of 5 years or more, and certainly a capital asset. Next slide, please. And starting at the top, the identified need, and we'll get to kind of some characterization on the next slide in a minute, but that's how we start off, and then we really do define the project, and as you can see within that scope, it's a little tough from a distance to see within the gray, but certainly identify scope, start some data, estimate costs, et cetera. And what I would point out, I think there's been considerable discussion at the commission level, and particularly with a couple of the members that have spent extra time in this, I think we've really tried to identify how we can improve or enhance, particularly from my perspective in the gray and in the yellow area there, and how can we improve communications and identification of scope is really critical up front, really at that gray portion. And then as it moves into adding into the CIP, which is in the yellow portion, and then it's all proposed, moves forward for city council approval, and then we proceed with the green. Next slide, please. Here is the list that I reference, and it's not in any particular order, with the exception of the treasurer's and the city manager's bosses up at the top, with mayor and council in their priority as the governing body. That's certainly critical in how we move forward with capital investments. I would also maybe skip down to second to the last, which is the master plan, and within that, in fine print, is the general plan. I often refer to that as the people's plan, and through 2035. And then we build many of the other plans, such as the character area plans, city council strategic goals to achieve that as identified by city council. Back up to the top, we've got the mandated pieces, sometimes that come down from other levels of government. We not so affectionately refer to these as the unfunded mandate. You may have heard that term for many years, and so that certainly occurs with us, and we have to implement that. Also, the emergency piece, as I mentioned at maybe some of our previous meetings, where whether it's our infrastructure or various other elements, there are risks in our community, and mitigating that risk is certainly a component in investing in capital improvements. Annual operating costs, that's always a tricky one. Is it going to increase costs? I think actually some of our projects that were maybe presented at the last commission meeting, there were some questions about how that could impact operating costs, operating programs. And in many instances, if there is a reduction in operating costs, a savings, then that can rank higher as on the list of capital projects that we're looking at. Matching funding over the previous recent years, there's been some significant amount of federal funding, and we look for those opportunities. There could be a limited or a different view moving in the next few years, and we're keenly aware of that. But I will point out maybe some of our enterprises, and more specifically maybe at our airport is a good example of those matching dollars and how we can leverage somebody else's funds to get improvements in our area. Also, economic vitality, economic growth. How can we invest, and I use that word invest, in capital infrastructure, and what that means to me is that there is a return on that investment. And that return could be in dollars. There could also be community benefit to those returns. Next slide, please. And so then we take all of that, and we have a process, as you might imagine, within our organization. We have staff levels that are, I'll call in the front line, but also in the middle of the organization, that is certainly aware of operational needs and bringing those forward for consideration. And then after that comes forward, then I would refer to it as the budget review committee that we have, which is staff, and we look at the long list of needs and see where funding aligns with the resources that we have, aligns with the expenditures that we are able to accomplish. Next slide, please. So again, back to the gray and the yellow portions. Why would a project cost change? And again, I think we've identified the opportunity in the gray portion first in that earlier slide of identifying and clarifying how we can get the most accurate cost for a project. We actually at some point will have an update on a couple of the projects that we presented to you at the last meeting, and through some of the appropriate questions that the commission have, we have updated a few areas to do what I would refer to as a feasibility, some initial assessment as it relates to cost, before we include a capital project cost that highly likely is not the full extent of what we need. So we appreciate the keen eye that the commission has put in that regard. And so I think that's an area of opportunity. And then as we get into the yellow part that on the earlier chart, really some impacts that are sometimes out of our control. How do we minimize that? There can be de-scoping opportunities, value engineering, et cetera. But as you see there, that might be some of the opportunity or issues that come to us that we have to deal with on a capital project. That completes my slides, and so it looks like, Mr. Chair, we have a question there.
Before we go into the second part of this, let me see if commissioners have questions on this first set of slides, the process. Hands are going up everywhere. Commissioner Newman.
City Manager Caton, in the bubble chart that you had, I was looking for a step there that says, should we do this project? Now I know there's a lot of things. Sometimes it's a project comes out of a plan. You say identify need, define project. But I'm sitting here going, okay, should we do this? And we kind of had a discussion about a couple of different projects here. Like if you take a substation that's going out, yes, we have to do that. You don't want the water plant going down. Okay, so there's not much of a discussion. Other projects maybe don't have quite as much. I had some questions about that when you think about, we had a question about adult daycare and things on one of the other projects. Is this where we should go? And I don't know where that step in the process is. I mean, you kind of talked about it there in terms of feasibility, and we had a thoughtful discussion about that yesterday on a project. So I'm curious as to where do we have that kind of that, let's put I call it business decision making and saying, here are alternatives. Does this make sense to do it this way, or should we combine it with something else? You kind of had those words in there, but there's no step somewhere to say, should we do this? And I think a lot of times we can get into projects as a city that maybe we don't intend to get into, or there's better ways to do it. So, and some things are driven by the council, some things are driven by a plan, other things just kind of start to happen because somebody thinks it's a good idea. Doesn't necessarily mean collectively think it's a good idea. And I think that step helps bring people together to decide, should we do this or not? So that's my question.
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Commissioner, I think you point out something that in our lovely chart here that is missing, but is in practice. So we simplified it here with the 5 bubbles, but I would probably say it's somewhere in between the orange and the yellow all throughout that process. So just kind of practically how it works. We have staff members identifying needs every day, quite frankly. Some are handled through operating and accomplished that way, and others are more significant. So it's put through that committee, if you will, and added to the list. Then as it comes forward to a higher level, to management review, we say, well, is this a need? Is it really a want? And run it through that. Almost kind of like a cylinder approach. Lots come in the top, and then it kind of filters out through the process. And then we end up, when the add piece, particularly at that yellow portion there, is really where we're scrubbing the budget. We are scrubbing the capital plan, as I refer to it, or refining the capital plan from, quite frankly, an initial list of hundreds of items down to a list that, one, we can afford and therefore is the highest priority. And then the priorities are based upon that next chart, which are safety, needs, and oftentimes, I'll be frank with you, that you'll have 2 competing very high priorities, and literally you just don't have enough dollars to fund both. So then we try to get creative. Can you phase it? Can you take a project and split it into 2? And then therefore get both of the emergency needs or the needs done. So it's really probably through that orange all the way through the yellow, and then the yellow is the balancing exercise. And we, not to get ahead of myself, but we do the same thing on the operating as well. But really the final culling out, the final where we balance is at the yellow piece, and that's what the treasurer, myself, and we have a small team that goes through that process.
Thank you.
Commissioner Carlin?
Yes, please. I have 2 things. I'm going to go on to the prioritization criteria. And, you know, the first one says it's based on the council's priorities, et cetera. And yet we've asked you questions, you know, here and everything. And the new council hasn't even had their retreat yet where they traditionally identify their priorities and the things they want to see. So in a way, we're working off of the previous councils, and I know that everybody has busy schedules, et cetera, and Ben Lane is juggling like crazy. But if there's any way to put in that calendar in your policy or whatever, that you try to have the council retreat first, so you can know what the current sitting council's priorities are. That's the first thing. Then the second thing is going back to the decision-making about what Commissioner Newman was talking about. My question is, where in this does community discussion come in to help determine importance? You know, or where in the process does the community actually have outreach? You know, you have outreach to the community so that you understand if it's really, really important to the community. Because if you get it after the fact and you're showing them this is what we're thinking of doing, as opposed to this is extremely important to our neighborhood, this is extremely important to our part of town. And the second part of that question is, I hate when things happen and decisions are made because the loudest voice wins, you know? Maybe a part of the city that has the money to hire a really good lawyer or something to that effect, or, you know, is personal friends with a certain number of council people. And I just feel like some people who don't know how to work the system as well as others, something really important to their part of the city might fall by the wayside because they're not the loudest. So where in this process does the community get a say, is my question. Thank you.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner, I would say throughout this process, so we honestly do receive it daily, feedback from community members. Some are louder than others, I will point out, but we certainly receive that feedback and we appreciate that feedback. The other thing I would say is I really did emphasize the master planning portion and the general plan. So the general plan is a significant part of our process and our funding. The other thing, with over 4,000 volunteers that we have within the city, is an enormous opportunity to stay really close to the community. I think that's critical. The other thing I love about the council manager form of government in the boards and commissions, such as this commission and the other commissions, really keep us as staff close to the community, where we are part of the community and have a good sense of what the needs are. So all of these are layered together. You build upon that base, that foundation of the general plan, and things do change. We're talking about already touching it or refreshing here in the next couple of years, because it's not long before it gets dated in this quickly evolving world that we live in. So the character plans, our outreach is extensive, so it's embedded in a number of these processes. So I wanted to start with that. And then with the city council and the timing, and particularly related to this chart, it's important to talk about the capital, which may be a little less nimble than our operating budget. The operating can be a little more nimble for our programs, services, and adapt. The difference on the capital side, so many of it is based upon really an emergency need or needs within the community and have a long lead time. As an example, had an opportunity to dig a little deeper into a certain road project over the last couple of days, and because of some inquiries. And that started back in 2021, 2022 with input from community members. And then that folds into the budget. Then we do a design. Then you'll see construction actually coming forward in spring of 2026. So sometimes it can take 4 to 5 years for some of those projects to come to fruition. So I wanted to address that as it relates to city council, that a lot of these are in the pipeline. Now, we can certainly pivot depending upon the direction from city council, but they certainly inherit a path that we're on. The other thing I would mention are so many of the capital projects are operational driven or operations driven, and I think fire department is a great example. So we've got a couple fire stations, 606 and 616, I believe. One's under construction, one's in this budget, which really serve the needs that we're constantly serve the needs of a growing community, and then also constantly in front of City Council talking about service delivery, service expansion, particularly the ambulance is a good example, and then how that relates to our rolling stock with ambulances, and then how delivery times, we constantly look, or excuse me, service delivery times in that area, constantly looking at those on how quick we're getting to the community members when they're in time of need, and then building those stations so that we can meet those expectations of the community. So I think those are a couple good examples how we're in constant contact with the community and then constant contact with City Council to meet the demands and the expectations.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Any other comments from commissioners? I will offer a comment on the slide with the prioritization criteria that you have up there. And it's probably, I don't know where it fits, but it certainly fits in the third from the bottom, the economic vitality. And you said there is an intent to figure out whether the project contributes to the improved economic vitality of the city and brings in improved revenue. I don't see anywhere a test of a project, and this may be more of an operating question, but the question would be very simply, does this affirmatively or negatively affect tourism? And I say that because I think all of us are subtly aware that tourism is, in fact, our biggest industry here in the city, and it is the economic underpinning of the finances of the city. And it's, in a big way, what makes the city a livable city. And I personally would like to see a litmus test, if you will, on every capital project and every operating initiative where we affirmatively ask our question, is this going to, affirmatively ask ourselves this question, is this initiative going to positively or negatively affect tourism? And it may be implied in the strategic plans and the goals and the priorities of council and the master plans and all this other stuff. But I would make a note, as I say, for myself, I would like for it to be a little bit higher litmus test for our city actions. Anyone else? Vice Chair Schweiker.
Yeah, I would like to second that, because everything that I look at on this commission, my first thing is, what's the effect on tourism? Because tourism, if it's good for the tourists, it keeps them coming here. If it's good for tourism, the effect of that is that we have a beautiful place to live and a wonderful place to live. So, not to mention that they spend a lot of money that we don't have to spend, because you can tax the tourists, that you don't have to tax us completely. So I agree with David that that should be embedded in there somewhere, is what's the effect of this on tourism?
Hearing no other questions on this first part of the presentation, then let's go to the work that was done by what I'll refer to as our subcommittee of two.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to make this presentation. I also want to thank Commissioner Schweiker for helping on this, because his background by being on the Paradise Valley City Council, I think, was helpful to get some insight. And this is a model possibly for our commission whereby a couple of people dig into something, because I found it very difficult to try to get some meat on things just in an open meeting presentation. And I found that if I can get with one person or separately with staff, you can sometimes get to the meat of what you need to have. So this is potentially something we can consider about how we're going to operate in the future. We can go to the next slide then. What the purpose of this meeting was, really all it was a meeting where we wanted to understand better what was going on in the contracting and project management area. We had heard there had been a lot of things referred to as overruns, and so Commissioner Swiker and I decided to see what we could start to learn about it. And I would say for myself, I'm probably at the 10 to 15% understanding level compared to where city staff is. So this is just we're in our infancy right now. But I'm going to share at least what we found out through that. Some of this I'll try to go through more quickly because it'll be just a touch redundant with what was presented earlier by the city manager. But this was all new stuff for Commissioner Swikert and I. So we'll go through this. What we went through, we looked at, it was fiscal 2024, so that's 2023 to 2024, and year-to-date 25. So for the last over a year and a half, they provided a list of all the contracts that were over, had a change of $1 million and 10% for us to look at. At that meeting, joining us were actually 15 members of the staff, including senior people, and that was quite a turnout. We can go to the next slide now. And it was to give us a high-level understanding of what was going on. We looked at 30 contracts that were on the list. We didn't inspect them all. We spent a lot of time talking about what was going on because one of the things we wanted to try to find is, are there some things going on that are causing these differences? Some of them likely have already been addressed. Others maybe have not. That might be part of a commission report, and we'll get to it at the very last slide. And the contracts we looked at, 10 of them were individual projects that were approved by council. There's also 7 through the budget process. It either happens during the year with council approving or it happens through the budget process, so a bunch of it happening right now. And then they're also called bundled projects. Some projects are standalone, that's easy to understand. Others potentially are across a lot of departments or cost centers, like if you put in a IT infrastructure, it goes over a lot of things, so it's not one standalone thing. So there's different complexities to all of them. On the things we looked at, the changes were anywhere from $1 million to $56 million, so there were some pretty big changes that were in there. And I won't go over the stated reasons again here. A lot of those are repetitive of what you heard before, so we can go to the next slide. And on the next slide, some of the common reasons for increases. We heard a lot on unforeseen drainage and right-of-way complications, so that'll tie into later to a question we might want to ask. COVID delays evidently caused an unusual spike in increases here by a multi-year delay. Not only was it inflation, but I think some of the contractors found themselves so busy that they took advantage of being able to get more aggressive on their pricing, which also was an adverse impact for us, so the COVID delays. And then we saw a lot of changes. Changes are probably the most expensive when they occur after the shovel's in the ground. And so there's different reasons why changes might have occurred as you decide to either change projects or you find some unexpected discoveries as you're doing it. And those are probably the most, some of the most costly changes you have because those are the things you didn't know were going to happen and then did happen. We can go to the next slide. Some of the challenges that we discovered took place in the projects. One of the things that's kind of tough is city has a lot of designers on staff, and do we do it all ourselves, or do we need to elicit some outside expertise in order to do it, in order to have the project be appropriately scoped and designed? We learned that there are 4 different ways the city tends to contract, and without getting into a lot of details, there's different elements to each one and different risk factors. If the city can fully design something to their satisfaction, they can do a low bid, in which case a low bid that is a bonded provider can actually get it. That puts less risk into the cost of that specific project, but if it wasn't adequately scoped, it can be very expensive through change orders. There's also what's called CMAR. I don't want to get into too many details, but that's where you kind of co-develop some of the design and go into the contracting with another party. Design build is when you do it with another company or a partnership or a joint venture, again, to share in some of the design features to try to minimize some of the build-out risk. And then there's job order contracting, which are generally for smaller projects, but that has a different way in which you select people because you go out through a request for qualifications, a scoring that takes place, and you have to select different people, and then there's a manner in which you can try to decide which one you're going to pick. So there's just a lot of complexities that have to go into that. A key decision is how much pre-design do you do before you go to the build-out. The more pre-design you do, maybe that minimizes the risk of what's going to happen when you do a build, but then that costs money, that takes time, so there's a lot of projects going on here. The coordination, City Manager touched on earlier, between the user project team, and you'll see that in a recommendation. I'll go over that a little bit later. But when you think about a user group and a design group and project managers, communication's kind of a key. And if you're not fully looking at all the elements of that and you're not appropriately engaged on that, problems can come out of that. And then lengthy delays like COVID we can go to the next slide, could also be another challenge. Okay, so I'm down to my final 2 slides on this part. What we wanted to do, we are really as a commission trying to find a way to add value to the city and to our constituents here. So one of the things I know I'm personally trying to do is what recommendations can I come up with our limited understanding as we get up to speed. And these are some of the recommendations. And a quote I got from someone one time I love is, it's if you only do what you always did, you only get what you always got. Okay? And I love that particular quote because it was a reminder to me during my working days that if I keep doing what I always did, I'm going to get the same outcome. And so the challenge here is, and I'm challenging ourselves in the recommendations we make, can we make recommendations that the city might say, hey, we ought to take another look at that, or we ought to look a little bit harder into that, or let's kind of check that a little bit more. And so when I look at some of the recommendations, one of the big ones that came out of that discussion that we had was, do the user departments engage deeply enough with design and project management to eliminate changes during construction? So what you've got to pick, you think about when I was working, if we were doing we were going to move into another building, that's not my core expertise, but I need to have office space for my people. If they say, okay, I'm going to have a designer and a project manager do that for you, Mark, then they'll start working on that, and someone will go, hey, Mark, you have a minute? Oh, yeah, I got a minute. And it says, here, look at this design. Does this look okay? Yeah, I guess that looks okay. And then I didn't totally focus on it necessarily. Well, that could be a problem because then as they start doing the build out and I start going, wait, you forgot to have restrooms on the floor. That's not a real example, but then it's all of a sudden I realized I should have spent more time looking at that. So the observation here might be, are we getting people engaged enough from a user standpoint and from a design build-out standpoint so that they're all working together and committed together? And I still don't know how that all works here as far as how many touch points you have as a project goes out. But I guess one recommendation is going to be, do you need to look at that process? To what extent are unforeseen adverse contract experiences integrated into future projects? As we got some of the presentations to us during the last week or so, we did hear that when we heard certain right-of-way and drainage problems coming, that they are being considered when you get into future projects. And so that was one of the observations. Are there certain types of projects that should have more advanced engineering or surveying to minimize future risks on things? I can't answer that for you, but it might make some sense to take a look at what are the more risky projects that we have, and are there some things we can do that might cause us less surprises as it goes on. Another one is adequate thought going into the future cost estimates for multi-year programs. I'm still not sure how important the 5-year type projections are, but I know you worry more about what you think you're projecting for next year than your out years. But if out years are going to be changes that are problematic to council, then maybe some more thought needs to go into that. And then finally, should multi-year projects factor in more possible cost items, like cushion? We called it cushion. Should you put some more cushion into things? If you do that, does that then mean you have to cut back on another project? I don't know. So then let's go to the final slide on our findings, and then our final one. Okay, with this one, we're not going to act on any of this stuff right now. Okay, what this is, or these are some of the recommendations we came up with, and what I really did this kind of for the commission. Here's an example of how we might consider wording things in a final report that would go to council. And we mentioned that staff may be accumulating this. If they are, this is just an example of how we might want to do things. And what I have here, I have two examples. One is a project-specific example. And the first one is one where there's an advanced water purification system. And my understanding is there's going to be a $50 million increase proposed in this budget. And it was because of expiration of permits and new regulations that require the recycling to be done in a different fashion that has significantly increased the cost. I don't have an opinion on whether that project's a good one or not. Personally, I kind of like it. But we're going to highlight that, I'm going to propose that we highlight that to council for a cost-benefit consideration about what they really need there. And then I've been talking too much now, so Commissioner Swiker, the next one you've had some personal experience with, so can you touch on that one?
Yeah, thank you. And Mark was a perfect person to be working on this because of his CPA background. He really knows how to delve into numbers and everything, and I take more of the 80,000-foot policy sort of overview of things. I'd like to start off by saying that the city staff who worked with us were very, very helpful. And you have to understand, in the current political climate, where you have a group like this, that people could look at us and make some parallels to things that are happening in other parts of the country. You know, you'd think it would be hard for people to open up and have a fruitful conversation, but they were very, very helpful, and they were good at coming up with ideas of things that they could do better and communication they could have better to make these projects more efficient. So I'd really like to thank the staff for that. One of the things we did when I was in the Paradise Valley Town Council was we got tired of projects that would always run over, and because most of ours were road projects and things like that, and it really inconvenienced our residents, those big capital projects. We started doing a project where we would go in there and we would figure out what the timeline was, and then we would write into the contract that there would be a penalty if the contract ran over, if the project took longer than was expected. Now, we would factor in rain days and things like that, so things that were out of their control or natural occurrences that they couldn't do anything about, we factored that in. But there would be a penalty if they just ran late on the project, if they took people off of our project and were working on another project, for example. But the flip side of that was we also paid them a bonus if they got the project done early. And son of a gun, they all got done early. We never had to penalize anybody. So I think it's something that I don't know the practicality of looking at it on all projects, but I think case-by-case projects, it would be a good thing to look at. And Mark was really good at leading this, so it was fun to sit there and delve into these projects and figure out the kind of things, because I think what we really want to do here is we're looking more at policy, or not policy, but process. How can we improve the process for the city to get a better outcome for less money? So I thought it was a very good few hours we spent with them.
Yeah, and we did get some excellent cooperation with the city staff, because when you're in a role like this, you kind of wonder if people are going to put up walls and get defensive, or whether they're going to be forthcoming with some information. And they were pleasantly forthcoming with some information that leads to this. And the third point there was the one I kind of touched on earlier. And again, I don't know how users work with the project managers, but in my mind, I'd love to see it where they're both in bed with each other, so to speak, so that they're both so committed that they're holding each other accountable to make sure everything's fully communicated and fully explored. And that's how you can minimize some of the surprises that take place. The other comment was increased contingency element on riskier projects. Some projects are just more risky than others. And so I can't answer this for you, but some of those, it's like, every time we do this type of road project or this type of construction project, it seems like something happens. Well, should we be factoring in some more contingency in there to be allocated later? I think some contingency is factored into contracts, but is there enough, and are we challenging that enough on some of these projects? And then on the multi-year ones, and also inflation factors, again, we're encouraging staff to make sure they include enough from an inflation factor standpoint for future cost increases that might happen. So that would be That'll be, that's kind of the end of this part of the presentation. Skip forward one more slide. I want to just tell you something that's in here. This is something that we had, that's not readable for you all, but this is something that we worked with staff to put together, and this is something different than what we looked at before. What this is a chart that I believe will be helpful to present to council when we meet with them on the budget. What I told you that Commissioner Swiker and I looked at everything through today, so to speak, what the current approved things are that council has seen. This has a middle column that's going to be future changes being requested through the budget process, and I'm not sure that was always highlighted quite to the same degree. And so this chart actually starts with, hey, what was it a year ago in last year's book? What is it today? Because some of them changed by council approving things. Column 3 is how much more are we asking for now in this new budget request? And then column 4 and 5 are the things that they actually approved that are going to be in the budget book. Column 4 is what's the new total cost? And column 5 is how much of that total cost are we spending next year? So I believe the schedule is going to tie very nicely and help council go through, because they're going to know where they're at a starting point. That way they can just focus on what's changing or any new projects that are in there. So I'd like to thank staff and Scott particularly for putting that together for us, because I think that'll be very helpful when we meet with council. So again, that's it. And I guess for the commission, the only thing I'll point you to, that last slide we went over, is a model to think about how you might want to report. And so just kind of a FYI example. And I guess if there's any questions, I don't know. If there's any questions for Commissioner Swiker, now would be the time.
Thank you both. Thank you both for the work that you did offline, and I'll echo your appreciation of the staff involvement and participation in educating the 7 of us up here so that we don't go down some rabbit holes that don't make any sense. The other thing I think I would comment generally on this, it has been a useful exercise and I hope a good presentation for people here. My takeaway from this, I think I've made a comment very early in one of our meetings, we're not on a witch hunt here. We're trying to figure out, is there something that we can discern from our experience and our additional set of eyes on these issues that we can share advice to council and to staff, and perhaps find a better way to avoid some of the problems that we've had in the past. And I would like to put in perspective this chart that Commissioner Stevens put up here at the end. It's my understanding that these, and there is a second page to this, I guess, too, if you flip the slide one page, yeah. These 31 projects that are enumerated here are, if I understand it correctly, all of the projects on which we are asking for, or which staff is asking the council to approve an increase in the budget. And it does not show in total, but if you looked at that slide, column 3, the fiscal 25-26 proposed changes, I think the total of all those proposed changes, everything that's council's being asked to increase the capital budget by, is something like $284 million. And is obviously dominated by some of the bigger ones, like the Advanced Purification Recycling Water Project, where a significant change is being asked. And maybe you do you have the totals? Am I looking at something that is the totals?
Actually, I totaled the column 4 and 5, not those the ones that they're going to approve, to get a feel for how many of the actual contracts are part of it. And it's like 30% of the total value and about 16% of what they're going to spend next year. So there's a lot more.
And I think that's the important point to make, is that, as I said, column 3 is they're going to council asking for $284 million increase. And then to the point that Commissioner Stevens mentioned, if you say, how much are we going to spend of that next year, of that $284 million increase, we're going to spend $163 million. And it's undeniably a lot of money, but understand these 31 projects, plus all of the projects that we are not asking for an increase for, and I keep using the word we, and I mean staff, but the total capital spend next year is proposed to be $1,006,000. And so on $1 billion collection of money to be spent next year, 163 is from the increased requests. And I think more significantly, since these requests are oftentimes for the 5 future years, over the 5 years, it's $2.5 billion or something like that. And so, as I said, not to minimize the number, but to put it in perspective, because the only ones that reach the headlines in people's minds are the ones that have large overruns for a variety of reasons. And I think I'd like to give a shout out to staff and to council for the work that they've done in managing a large portfolio of projects and a large expenditure budget with a, relatively speaking, small overrun. I do have a comment from the desk down here, and I hope I haven't said something wrong that you're going to correct me publicly on.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to clarify that this list that you're looking at with the 31 projects on it, these are in fact projects that we are requesting an increase that meets the threshold of $1 million and 10%. There are other projects that are potentially requesting increases that do not meet that threshold and are therefore not on this list. Thank you.
These are the offenders, if you will. At any rate, enough of the compliments on the hard work staff is doing, and I hope that some of our comments will be helpful to council and helpful to staff in the future in understanding the priorities. And we have other comments. Commissioner Newman.
Just a clarifying question. I go down and I realize it's a summary explanation for change, scope, inflation, scope. You go down the list, a lot of inflation, things like that. But some of these things, if I look at the kind of project it is, if I take Scottsdale Sports Complex, it says scope. Now, if it's a water project, you find something unexpected and you have to do something, I get it, or a substation goes out and you have to replace it. I mean, those are unexpected scope changes. Do we have different types of scope change, or do you clarify that? Because if it's just, well, we wanted to do something different on something, that's one thing. And I would put that at lower priority, unless there's a compelling reason to do it, versus we found something that makes sense to spend more money to go dig deeper foundations or whatever it is, or a wash project that we found some things we didn't expect, and we needed to make a change there, and it cost millions of dollars to do it, but it makes sense to do it now because it'll cost more later. Do we clarify and stratify that for council, for the council, so that they know what they're approving?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Newman, speaking of the project that you're speaking of, project number 2, the Scottsdale Sports Complex turf replacement, my understanding of that project is that the original project was completed as originally intended, but they are seeking to now do turf replacement at additional fields. And based on the administrative nuances of how those projects are, how those tasks, I guess, are fit into existing CIP projects, we label that as a scope, because we were trying to fit all of these into 4 categories, which was inflation, scope, conditions, and phased. And so of those 4 options, we felt that scope fit the best. And so that's why we chose that particular one for that project. And if I said anything wrong, I'll call on, I guess, Nick Molinari to correct me.
And I'm not being critical of any particular project, but let's use it as an illustrative example. Scope creep happens. Is that scope creep because, gosh, those fields look really nice, let's do them over here? Well, that's getting outside the intent of the original project. Should that come back for approval again when we can prioritize that money and do that, versus one that says, no, hey, we've got a big hole in the road and we have to do this because we found a big cavern down there we got to fill in and it's $1 million and there are millions of dollars to do that. So scope creep can happen, and it can't be just because, oh, we want to do it. It has to be a compelling reason to have that kind of scope creep. So there's different types of scope here when you say the word scope.
if I may, Mr. Chair and Commissioner, and just to add a little bit to what my colleague was saying, let's pick one that addresses the fire station. It's maybe a good example. And I think what we said is scope change. You added the word creep, which is usually not a good word as it relates to budget. So we, as reference, we were just trying to identify with these limited categories, and I'll use the fire station as a point where it's critical. And I think what is happening is no good deed goes unpunished, and by staff, and what I mean by that, we really are mindful of the public dollar, and so often look to remodel, rebuild, things of lesser value. And then what happens is when you get into the building, when you get into the fire station, you have more extensive needs that you wouldn't have figured out until you get into the project, and then it turns into a more significant. That's the creep. And sometimes there's no way to know that until you get into the project. And the fire station's a great example of that.
You know, I agree with you. There's hidden things, but then you can also have, using the word scope creep, it's a real word, it's a real term in capital projects, is that, well, we could do this, well, we could do this, well, and at some point you have to draw a line.
Yeah.
And that's discipline. And so there are things that says, no, we have to do this because we found asbestos. We have to replace that, or whatever, remediate that. There's things that happen just because it would look nicer if we put new ceiling tiles in. That's scope creep.
Yeah,
and we should be able to determine those things at the beginning so we don't get that, we know what we're approving, and we don't have those kinds of changes. I'm not saying that's all through the thing, but I'm just trying how to think about scope change and the various categories that it falls into.
Commissioner Carlin.
Thank you. Yes, I have two questions. On sample commission report recommendations, draft points, on your first one about the purification recycle water project, it says it's due primarily to new regulatory requirements. To me, requirements means you have to do it. But you say we should highlight this to council for cost-benefit consideration. If it's a requirement, then how could the council say no? Is there another word that should be used there?
No, the cost benefit would be, was this too big of a project to take on and we need to find other sources of water rather than recycling water? That was the intent of that.
Right, but I'm just asking, should you use another word than requirements? Because requirements means it's something in the existing facility you have, you're going to have to do. That's,
I thought this was all perspective, like it was part of the design. If you now want to go forward with this, here's the things you need to incorporate into your design.
Okay, only if you're making changes. Yeah. Okay, all right. Then the other one is on the other side on recommendations and questions, the third bullet. Are there certain types of projects that should have more advanced engineering, et cetera, to avoid expensive during project delays? I'm thinking about the roundabout near my house at Miller and Osborne, which went way over budget and way over time because when they got down there, they found, I can't remember if it's an SRP pipe, somebody's pipe was in really bad shape. So that then had to change. My question is, if you're doing a project in the older part of town, like Miller and Osborne, does it require more testing so that you can avoid those types of things? Because you know that the infrastructure down there is pretty darn old.
Well, that's a wonderful question, Mr. Chair and Commissioner. I think that might need to be a follow-up and look into my colleagues. What I would say as a general practice, though, just talking about road work and then working with utilities, is having good coordination meetings, and I've discussed this with staff, and I understand that this occurs here. And so just to lay that out, what that looks like in practice is we have this capital improvement plan, and we're looking out 3 and 5 and even beyond that years. And so meeting with the utility providers so that they can get in if they have improvement plans planned. then they can get into those areas and make those improvements before we do our road improvements. Does a couple things. One, increases the coordination. Two, what we don't want is to put in new asphalt and then them to come in afterwards and cut. So I think we certainly do it, but I think there is an opportunity to always enhance that communication and collaboration, and the further out we look, that helps because of lead times. That's been one of the challenges for all utility providers, all the infrastructure improvements, is the lead times on these projects, and so they'll need to get that product moving in order to get it in place so that we can do our transportation enhancements.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I just specifically was curious if in the older part of town, where you have that infrastructure that you know is older, is there a requirement with, other people who have pipes, whatever, down where you're digging, that they do an evaluation first? I'm just curious, and I know you may not be able to answer it now. And other than that, I just want to say thank you to our small working group and staff for all the time they put into this, because it was very helpful.
And if I could chime in on that just for a second, I forget what the exact situation was we were talking about when we were having our meeting up there, but there was one of them where they were getting into something and they discovered that there was a utility problem under the ground, but I forget if it was APS or who. They had prior rights there that we had to go in and correct at our expense whatever the problem was under there. So, you think you know where everything is in all these roads, but when we built our China Mist building, it was beautiful. We were there for maybe 2 years. We finished out some offices, so we decided we want windows into the warehouse. So we knew where everything was. So we said, yeah, we hired somebody to come and cut areas to put in windows. Son of a gun, there were electrical and plumbing pipes behind that wall that weren't on any of the blueprints or anything. So you can imagine what a city's like when it's 50 or 70 years old. You never know what you're going to run into when you start digging up the ground. So some of those things just happen.
Commissioner Newman, did you want to have the last word?
Just a question to clarify. Lines 15, 16, and 17, they all say inflation, yet if I'm understanding this right, the 25, 26 proposed changes are multiples of the original project just last year. And it says inflation. I mean, these are hundreds of % inflation over 1 year. That can't be, that's an outlier for me.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Commissioner Newman, I'd have to defer to city staff that could potentially explain the nuances of that.
Yeah, I just highlighting that if you want to get approval on that, I think you've got to explain that to council as to why that kind of inflation is occurring.
Can I just do a final comment on that? This document didn't exist 2 days ago, okay? So this just came together fairly quickly. I'm the one that forced them to only have 4 descriptions that are one word to explain stuff. So this thing just came together like late last night or whatever. And I had the same question you did, and I asked them to look into to find a better description. My goal on this is to have a single word or a couple of words so that when council looks at it like you just did, if they'd say, how can it be 40 million inflation? Well, now it might later on say scope inflation, and then they'll be ready to answer. So I just wanted trigger words there so council could decide where to ask.
This will be a trial run for council review.
Because I thought this would be helpful for them. I'm just trying to make their life easier.
I think they're doing a great job. Those if I were going through this list, I'd say, wait a minute, so go ahead.
Chairman, Commissioner Newman, I'll take number 16, Jomax Road Sewer Improvements. This was actually started, as Commissioner Steven pointed out, this is a multi-year document. 2015, original cost was about $6 million. Wasn't going in, and this is up on Jomax up north, I forget the cross streets. Then after a few years, they went and updated it. It was actually $15 million. Then as we go through this is part of our infrastructure improvement plan, and as we updated it, the cost did go up to what you see now, $55 million. It is slated for 2028, depending on the cost to start the construction. we may or may not do it. We may have to push it out further because it may be too expensive. So it's not going from 15 million and 55 million that, hey, this is the initial project. The initial project was over 10 years ago, actually going on 13 years of we need to get this sewer in. In this area, it has dry sewers, so it's septic systems with dry sewers, so there are pipes in the ground. Once we get this infrastructure in, they can connect. The piping's already there. That was already put there. So this is kind of misleading in the sense that, hey, this is just within a few years. This is 13 years that we've been planning for it.
So you're saying we're talking about a decade's worth of
Correct.
construction inflation,
Yes.
or more than a decade?
In the location, it's over a mile. We have to do gravity, and then we have to build a pump station. Then we also have to do force main to get it back to gravity, to get to the water campus to recycle that water, treat it and recycle it. So you're talking a couple miles right there just in piping alone. Large diameter piping. An example of that is in your neighborhoods outside where you live, you have 8-inch pipe. This is 18-inch, 21-inch, and typically the bigger the pipe, the deeper you have to go.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Just when it goes to council, maybe a little bit more of that.
And that's a good recommendation, a good clarification on that.
Yeah.
So thank you. Anything else?
Seeing no further questions, so I think we have overwhelmed ourselves with information here. At this point, why don't we go on to agenda item number 4, which is to talk about the timeline and the proposed process for commission review and recommendations, and Sonia will lead us through that discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And next, get the slides up. Okay, we've had 4 meetings with the commission to date, and we have another 3 meetings in April before our joint work study with council. So I thought this would be a good time to do a midpoint check-in and prepare the commission for the upcoming meetings in April. Next slide. Just a quick recap, and for the benefit of any citizens watching for the first time, the duties of the commission include...
Sonia, I think the slides are not coordinated with the verbiage.
Yes, they are. So this is the slide I'm on right now.
Okay, all right. Proceed on. I apologize.
I was just trying not to just read off the slides. So this is just a quick recap, and also for the benefit of any citizens watching for the first time, the duties of the commission that's laid out in the council adopted ordinance includes reviewing the proposed budget each year before the council adopts the tentative budget, reviewing specifically the proposed operating budget and capital budget, major revenue forecasts, and also budget policies. Next slide. These are the items reviewed by the commission to date, which includes budget policies reviewed in February and major projects in the proposed fiscal year 25-26 capital budget, which was reviewed in the last 2 meetings. Our proposed fiscal year 25-26 operating budget will be finalized and released next week. So I'm not going to go through this list in detail, but this is just a recap for the commission and also for our audience, that these are all the items that the commission has looked at and reviewed over the last 4 meetings. Next slide. And from those 4 meetings, some of these topics were identified by the commission for further or future review, including looking at maintenance, repair, and replacement costs, and specifically reserves for maintenance and repair. There was also discussions on the PCI for streets, maintenance and replacement of facilities, and looking at whether we need to beef up reserves for those. There was also discussion of bringing back in the future a more robust conversation of grant-funded operations, specifically in light of the uncertainty of federal grant funding, and also discussions of cost-benefit of outsourcing versus in-house services, and also the incremental cost of maintaining our AAA bond rating. And there was also discussion and interest in ensuring financial sustainability, considerations of opportunity costs, and level of service. These will be parking lot items to be reviewed after the commission completes review and recommendations for the proposed 25-26 budget. The budget staff are currently in the process of finalizing the proposed 25-26 budget, and we will release the city's official proposed budget document on Thursday next week. And it's going to be a budget binder with the whole entire proposed 25-26 budget, and it will be available for the commission probably Friday morning. We'll try to get it done by Thursday afternoon. Next slide. The next 3 meetings in April will be devoted to reviewing the final proposed budget as presented in the proposed budget document that you will receive. The proposed budget document will contain a lot of details of all the revenues, all funds, and all departments. It will include comparisons of revenues and expenditures to the current year as well as to the last fiscal year. The budget document will also have expenditures by department for all departments, and it will also have revenues and expenditures by fund for all funds, including our 5-year forecast for all funds. With the limited time we have, we will only be presenting certain major departments and funds on April 7th and 10th. And I will go over which major departments and funds we will cover. April 11th will be set aside for the commission to discuss and finalize recommendations before the April 22nd joint meeting with council. And to help organize the commission's thoughts and recommendations, Chairman Smith at the last meeting requested commissioners send recommendations to our city attorney and Sherry Scott. And I believe that our city attorney will be sending out an email with more guidance on that following this meeting. And we will, Greg and I will work with her to put together the recommendations for the April 22nd work study with council. So far I've rambled a lot on a process. Is there any questions before I move on?
Commissioner Stevens?
Yeah, my question overall on all this, like on revenue, you told us about the revenue funds, but we haven't really looked at what the revenue changes are, and the same thing for expenses. Whatever we're going to get, if it's just like the budget book you have that shows the differences, that's nice, but it doesn't give us any substance as to what went into it or any thought that went into it. I guess I was hoping, or is there any way to have the equivalent of like a management discussion and analysis, or a thing that would tell us more about what's going on there? Like for revenues, here's these 3 categories of revenue, this one's down, this one's up, here's why, something qualitative. Or on the departments, here's some of the budget changes, we can see the changes, but if there's a couple that appear worthy of comment, will there be anything narrative for that? Or are we just going to be looking at raw budget books just like the big book you put together?
Commissioner Stevens, the proposed budget document will have some narrative. There will be some narrative discussing the forecast changes of revenues at a high level for our major revenues. With our presentation on April 7th, we will also be discussing what went into those projections and why we projected the numbers we projected. So it will be both some limited narrative in our proposed budget, and through the presentation, we will provide that qualitative explanation and discussion. And as far as the departments are concerned, the department pages will have some narrative on mostly the requested, the items that are requested in the fiscal year 25-26 budget. So the major changes between 24-25 and 25-26.
And I guess what I'm hoping, it would be music to my ears if some of your department directors would say, oh, we took a look at our unfilled FTE positions and we determined that 3 of them we didn't need, so we've taken that out of the budget. But we also had to add another one over here because I have a service thing I needed. So just so you know, that would be music to my ears that everyone actually dug in and then shared some of that with us.
Yeah, so I think we were planning to have that as a presentation discussion, because at this time, we don't have enough time to add the narrative to the proposed budget document.
Okay, but if the department head's going to at least share some of the substantive things they did that were changes, just to let us know they put a lot of thought into it, that would just help us rather than just looking at changes in numbers, so I'd appreciate that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yes.
Commissioner Newman?
Just thinking about the parking lot items here, I understand there's many things that we can push off till the summer, but there's a couple of items that we've gone through in the previous slides that I think we should put some attention to. One is, we've talked about the roads condition, and of course, every year the roads get 1 year older and the PCI continues to decline. I know there's going to be a study coming out soon. I looked at the chart that was presented. It's $20–30 million in the budget that's needed to kind of get on with this program. To me, it's pretty obvious that we're going to get on with that program and figure out how to get the PCI turned around and moving in the right direction, because there's a critical cliff that we fall off of, and then you're doing base failures, roads, things like that. So we can parking lot that, but to me, it's very obvious that that's low-hanging fruit that we should prioritize. And I'd like to see that in the budget there. And the other one would be, we've talked a lot about pension pay down and getting, from a fiscal standpoint, to get us to a place that where we have less risk in the pension. Those promises have been made. So I think those are things that we should talk about, even though there may be parking lotted items and more analysis. But let's not wait a year to figure that out. I think we can make the decision to do that now. That would be my ask in some of the work study work that we consider.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Newman. So we did, as you know, as we were conducting these budget commission meetings through March, we were also putting the proposed fiscal year 25-26 budget together, and we did incorporate a lot of these conversations and discussions. So what you'll see in the proposed budget is we did increase the budget for street overlay. Thank you to our interim city manager who did some magic on the budget and moved some dollars around, and so you will see that. You'll see that we have significantly increased the overlay budget for fiscal year 25-26. We do have in our budget a proposal to pay down additional PSPRS debt to hopefully bring that funded status up to around 80%. And you will also see, based on these discussions, for the Commission's interest in seeing some reserves for maintenance, we have also put a line item for reserves for maintenance. So we have incorporated, to the best of our abilities, some of these parking lot items, even though they haven't been thoroughly studied or discussed,
Excellent, thank you. That's very practical, and I think we can all agree that we're going to do something around those things, and so it's there. Thank you.
So before I move on to the next slide, so back to the April 7th meeting, like I said, we will present the big picture overview of the city's proposed budget for fiscal year 25-26, and then we will dive into some of the major departments and funds. Next slide. The major departments and funds that we plan to have specific presentations on April 7th and April 10th are listed on the slide. They're our major departments like police, fire, transportation and infrastructure, parks and recreation and preserve, and our library and human services. And then to the right there, the general fund, tourism fund, transportation fund, and preserve tax fund. Each of these department presentations will also address the FTEs, the unfilled positions and overtime, and any significant budget requests. And these departments were selected based on feedback from the Commission at one of our very early meetings, and also direction from our chairman. Next slide. And this is a list of the departments that we are not scheduled for specific presentation. However, even though we're not having specific presentations on these departments and funds, the Commission will still be able to review the budgets of these departments and funds, because the budget document you will receive will have all funds and all departments. And the department staff will be available at the April meetings for any questions you might have. So what I hope is that this gives the Commission a roadmap and sort of an idea of the upcoming meetings in April and how we can get through the proposed 25-26 budget. And with that, I can answer any other questions you might have.
Does anyone up here have a question? Or shall we just march forward? Commissioner Carlin.
I just want to thank you very much, Sonia and staff, for doing this, because when I asked last time for a gut check, I think this is exactly what we needed. So thank you.
Commissioner Stevens, you want to congratulate them as well?
What's that?
You want to congratulate them as well as
Well,
Commissioner Carlin?
they've been so patient with me, and I can be kind of detail-oriented or whatever, and everyone's just been so patient with me, so thank you. My wife's laughing out there. So thank you for being so patient and responsive to me. The only thing I was going to mention is Enterprise Fund, the water's huge, but I think you had mentioned earlier, I was reminded that we're just not going to deal with the enterprise funds unless something jumps out at us. So I'm just saying that I think I agree with that, and that there's something that's particularly troublesome that one of us can just go ask for a clarification.
Yeah, I think the selection of departments to review and funds to review was more order of magnitude and staff time to make presentations. But as Sonia said, the whole budget will be posted. You said next Friday morning, good Lord willing, and the creek don't rise. So each of us can individually pull that up online and formulate questions that we may have, and I'm sure they'll have answers or wing it somehow. Other comments? Commissioner Newman.
Just a comment on the enterprise funds, and just, we can talk about it offline or here. If the enterprise fund, like each resident is going to see a increase over a certain amount or whatever, or a change, a significant change, is there anything you see right now to say, hey, there's certain things that are going to drive significant changes? You might want to look at the enterprise fund if there's going to be something that people would react to, but if it's going to be pretty normal, then I'm not too worried about it at this point. You know, we can talk about that later, but Sonia, you can tell us if there's anything, any surprises there, I guess.
Yeah, Commissioner Newman, thank you for the question. The commission can certainly request us to bring some presentation on any of the enterprise funds if you would like. Our largest enterprise fund is our water reclamation. The cost drivers are the purchase of the CAP water, which the cost of that CAP water has increased, chemicals, electricity, and personnel. And, you know, Kevin is here if you want more specifics about that. And those are normal operating costs of our water and wastewater utilities. Then there is also all the infrastructure costs. And we do have planned a rate study, an update to our rate study, which we do every 5 years with a consulting firm, with a rate consultant. We will plan to do an update of our rate study next year. For this year, we've already gone to council in March, presenting I think 4 and 6%. I can't remember the exact number, but somewhere around 4 or 6% rate increase for water and wastewater. So it's a very reasonable rate increase to cover these operating cost increases and also the capital costs.
Yeah, the 4 to 6% is what I was looking for. It's not 20%, and then you say why. So there's nothing like that. So no need for us to spend time reviewing that in detail at this point. But when the new study comes out, then obviously we'll be interested in that. Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Let's go on to item number 5. If there is anything, this is where each of you commission members can request that an item or proposed topic be placed on a future agenda. If anyone has anything to suggest. Commissioner Stevens.
Tell me what you think about this. I'm struggling about trying to set a format together for how we're going to approach things. I'm considering having an agenda item proposed that would say we have a discussion by the commissioners on ideas and approaches for future year reviews. Because I'm not sure, because we can't talk. I can talk to you, but that's it. And what do you think of having an open forum where we all talk about, hey, next year, why don't we set together a program for who's going to attack water, how we're going to do this, or what we're going to look at, just to start a discussion. So I guess I want to know if there would be value to having that as an agenda item to start talking about it.
Sure. I'm not sure how we would agendize that. I would suggest that maybe when we're intending to have on April 11 what's called work study session, which is a far less structured kind of discussion. It will be guided by whatever collectively we have submitted as being the topics we'd like to see moving forward to a council proposal. but maybe that would be the less structured approach. Let me ask the city attorney if she's wants to chime in on this as to what we can and cannot do.
Well, we could certainly add an agenda item for the commission to discuss possible future recommendations, and that way you have that on the agenda and you could discuss that. I think the priority is definitely getting this first batch of recommendations to council in the timeline that it's required. But we could have an agenda item if that's the commission's desire that allows some of those discussions amongst the commissioners on future items.
I can.
So we could have something that, in layman's terms, just says this agenda item is what's on your mind.
Yes, we might want to add a few words to that, but yes, generally.
Would that be responsive to what you're looking for, Commissioner Stevens?
It would be. Here's where I'm coming from. I was a financial auditor at Ernst & Young, so I'm used to when you go audit a company, here's all the things you're planning on doing, here's going to do what, here's what you're going to do in each of these areas, here's who's going to do it, and then as you find stuff, you change things. So way down the road, I'm wondering if each of us are eventually going to say, hey, here's what I want to do. I want to look at some projects during the year. I want to look at one of the departments. I want to meet with someone on this, just to give us a framework for what we each want to do. And this thing can all wait till after we're done with this year if you'd rather do that. But because my proposal will otherwise be to just, I was going to move that an agenda be added for discussion by commissioners on ideas for approaches to future reviews. So it was broadly like that so we could talk. But I'm really indifferent because we got a lot to do. So I'm okay if you just want to park this for now.
I think realistically, it will be something that happens after we've finished the budget review.
I made no motion. No motion.
No motion. But hold on to it, and we'll try to facilitate that to guide the discussion in the what I call post-budget period. Any other items from any commissioners or comments before we adjourn? If not, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Newman made a motion to adjourn. I think Vice Chair Schweiker seconded it. All in favor, raise your hand. Anybody opposed spends the night. It's unanimous.